What is the biggest concern facing Americans right now in terms of nutrition that you don't feel is being taken seriously enough right now?
I think what people don't realize is, in your 20s, your body may have the adaptive mechanism to recover.
We all need to be more meat. We need to be more animal protein. We need to be less this, that. The diet culture is usually at each other's throats.
Remember, you can overconsume calories, but yet still be malnourished.
Let's say we do get this metabolic test. Let's say we do get this biomarker, this genetic marker back. Is that set in stone?
Okay, well, even if we have these markers, what can we do from a lifestyle, dietary standpoint that can actually kind of lower those risks? Hi, my name is Kurt Hong. I'm the Chief Medical Officer for LifeForce. I'm also the Clinical Professor of Medicine at Keck School of Medicine. Welcome to Ever4 Radio.
Dr. Hong, welcome to the show officially.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Thank you for being here. Out of the gate, somebody like yourself who has had so much experience in academia and medicine and life, what is the biggest concern facing Americans right now in terms of nutrition that you don't feel is being taken seriously enough right now?
So I think the focus has been on overnutrition, but I think more and more we're really focusing more on also the quality of food. If you look at kind of where a lot of kind of certain areas where longevity, we often talk about the blue zones. It's really about kind of how they approach food. Food is really part of their culture. It's part of their lifestyle. It's not just the calories they consume during their meals.
It's not just one food group or one vegetable, one thing. It's the whole picture, you're saying.
Exactly. And you have to kind of go into it with the right kind of framework in terms of kind of how you approach not just a diet, but really kind of the food selection, how food can potentially influence how you feel, how you think. More and more we recognize that food, yes, it can influence your weight, but it can also influence, the quality of your sleep, emotional state, and so forth.
Food and sleep. I'm so glad you bring that up because as someone who is very aware of a lot of things in his life, and I know my audience is with me. Maybe we're following a food plan, we're tracking on a wearable. I'm rocking 2 here. We have a food log, or we are aware of certain variables that move the needle for us, or ones that maybe have room for improvement. The biggest thing for me when it comes to nutrition and sleep, I was amazed at how close these two work together. On my Whoop data, when I eat late, when I eat within a 1 to 2 hour window of going to bed, the way that my sleep diminishes, it's as if I had a couple of glasses of wine or alcohol. It almost does the exact same damage in terms of my sleep quality and quantity, eating close to bedtime as consuming alcohol does.
So if you look at kind of our circadian rhythm, how our metabolism changes when we first wake up in the morning in terms of how our body's metabolism generally will slow down toward the end of the day. Our body's ability to metabolize carbohydrate, our body's ability to metabolize a high fat diet, which unfortunately we frequently will treat our dinner as the biggest meal of the day. It kind of works backwards. If you look at a lot of other parts of the world or people who practice fasting, they frequently will value, the breakfast or even lunch as their bigger meal and only eat a smaller snack, particularly toward the ends of the day. And a lot of people, they will actually purposely grab an early dinner and just don't eat anything at least 3-4 hours before their bedtime. Because kind of going back to where you're going for, in terms of kind of understanding our body's ability to overcome, particularly some of the insulin resistance we see in a lot of our overweight and obese patients, really eating a high carbohydrate, particularly processed carbohydrate or high fat diet, it's just not optimal.
So am I hearing you correctly that it might not be as, when we're looking at what might be diminishing our sleep quality within that time window, it's more so related to the macronutrient profile, not as much maybe the quantity of calories or even that time window?
Absolutely. Even though the two probably will go hand in hand. Yeah, high carbohydrate, high fat diet, probably calorically is going to be a little bit higher as well. But you're absolutely right. Quantity is not the only part of the equation, it's also the quality.
What about when it comes to somebody, and I definitely want to get in, more in depth to intermittent fasting versus periodic fasting in a little bit, but while we're here, what about someone who is intermittent fasting or just whether that's intentional or just the way their life is, they're getting all of or the bolus of their calories at the end of the day. That's their dinner. So it's either I gotta get all this food in, or else I'm gonna have weight gain issues, weight loss issues, body composition. It's not gonna work with my body composition goals, basically, because at the end of the day, we all need sufficient calories to exist, to have energy, to build muscle, to do all these things. What about somebody in that window? Is it better to still get in your bolus, majority, all of your calories, even if it is late at night, or should we be tailoring that back into a certain time window?
So when a lot of the initial studies got published in terms of looking at the various forms of intermittent fasting, whether it's the 5-2 plan, where again, you fast for 2 days out of the 7 days, or the more popular plan, which is the 16-8 diet, where you try to consume all of your calories within that 8-hour window. It was really not designed for people to try to play catch up at the end of the day.
Really?
And remember, there are lots and lots of studies that's really been published over many years showing that, breakfast is actually an important part of the day. For people who consume breakfast, they're more likely to maintain a healthier weight. If you look at the risk for diabetes and metabolic syndrome, people who actually consume breakfast, they actually do better. I think it's just more from our kind of busy lifestyle standpoint. It's much easier just to grab a cup of coffee and not eat anything in the morning.
Right.
And then you get really busy, and then you get really hungry at the end of the day. Then you realize, wait a second, I still need to eat.
Yeah.
But going back to kind of what I was saying, if your body's metabolic efficiency is slowing down at the end of the day, that's about the worst time you should be consuming a 1,200 or 1,500 calorie meal, just because that's kind of your caloric goal.
Interesting.
So I actually would suggest, you know what? Yes, you can still fit that 8-hour window, but shift that window earlier.
Okay.
And try to, again, wrap up most of your meals, hopefully no later than about 5:30 or 6 p.m.
Yeah, again, I've been floored at the data. When I look at my personal Whoop data here, I wear a Whoop physical activity tracker. And the days that I wake up, that I genuinely do not feel my best, like I don't feel I got the best sleep, I don't feel as energized. Usually for me, I need about 3 seconds and then I'm up, I'm ready to go. Right. And so when I look at my data and I look at my sleep, I look at lowered REM sleep, I look at lowered sleep quality, sleep quantity. And I go back and the food log is like, yeah, I had a meal close to bedtime. Right. And it pretty much damn near every time does the same thing as if I have, any alcohol.
Yeah, and I think what people don't realize is, in your 20s, your body may have the adaptive mechanism to recover. As we all get older, with a lot of the hormonal changes, loss of lean muscle mass, we just fully expect basically, again, your risk for developing kind of excess body weight, particularly in the abdominal visceral fat, becomes more problematic, particularly if you eat late.
A lot of your work centers around nutrition, like we've been kind of already talking about, as well as, understanding obesity. And we can't talk about obesity and we can't talk about nutrition without the standard American diet. And so my question for you around that is, can this realistically change? Can we realistically improve the standard American diet? What changes need to happen at the macro level in terms of maybe, government, community, public health and things like that, but also at the micro level? Or do you think this is something that just is a lost cause?
I definitely think we have to start somewhere, because whatever we've been doing the past 20, 30 years is not
That's
working.
what I'm saying. What have we been doing?
So
not a lot.
But I also think, while there's what's idealistic, there's also kind of what can we do practically to get the ball rolling. Mm-hmm. And I think as a first step, we need to recognize, in terms of some of the original ideas, and, back in the 80s, we're talking about basically, different food groups. Mm-hmm. You need to have X servings of basically, red meats,
starches, sugar, fats, grains, things like that. Yeah.
And that's been really thrown out the window. Yeah. If you really look at some of the newest recommendation that's been put out by the USDA, it's really looking at kind of how can we put together the food groups as a whole to really kind of focus on kind of minimizing the risk for developing age-related chronic diseases and hopefully also improve health span and longevity. But I think just even taking a step back even further, I think overnutrition obviously is still a big problem. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, probably all of us, can figure out ways to cut out particularly some of the calories we probably don't need. And if we are noticing that we are gaining weight, definitely more the priority to try to do so. Mm-hmm. But once we kind of have that in place, I think one of the things probably most people can agree on is most of us were probably not doing enough plant-based regimens.
Okay.
And whether it's the healthy fruits, the healthy vegetables. So there are actually some wonderful studies showing that if you look at the recommendations for healthy heart diets, we recommend anywhere between about 30 to 35 grams of fiber daily.
Which most people, even when you're trying,
They
are
don't get.
not hitting. It's hard to do that.
You'll be surprised how many patients they barely are able to hit 15 grams a day. And I think it goes back to, we're all about what can we do right now? Can we grab a fast food? And even when we're not buying stuff from restaurants, we're getting stuff from grocery store that are already prepackaged. And it goes against, our whole concept of, trying to prepare something from scratch, if at all possible, even if you can't do it daily.
So I heard you say plant-based in there. And I personally do not abide by any particular diet. At this point, kind of being in the profession and also just a curious person trying to optimize his health for about 20 years now, I've kind of dialed in what works best for me. I'd say if I had to pick, it would be like that 80-20. 80% of the time, I'm really on top. 15 to 20% of the time, I'm kind of, wilding out. My question is, oh my gosh, it just left me. Oh, excuse me. It's an American diet. Oh, excuse me. Okay, I'm bringing back to the plant-based. Yes, there we go. So I heard you mention plant-based in there. And again, as someone who does not abide by a particular diet, I will say that over the years, when I come back to center and I focus more on increasing and keeping more vegetables, more fruits in my diet, I definitely feel my best. I feel like I have healthier eliminations. I feel like, I know it's serving my overall health. Do you feel like plant-based is the best way to go for most Americans, most humans, getting away from plant-based protein, plant-based foods, or is it just kind of finding that right dynamic for humans? Because then there's a lot of controversy out there now of, we all need to be more meat. We need to be more animal protein. We need to be less this, that. The diet culture is usually at each other's throats, but I'm curious what's your take on it?
Yeah, so protein's been a sexy word that's been thrown around really a lot. Everything's about keto. Everything's about can we do something that's high protein, whether our beverages out there, protein shakes, protein bars. But I think if you look at, again, pockets of the world where longevity is something where they've been able to achieve, it's really kind of they consume a huge amount of plants, basically, whether it's coming from fruits or vegetables, and definitely a lot of whole grain. And obviously, with that kind of comes with a much higher consumption of the fiber.
Okay.
So if you look at some of the really well-established diet, I'm going to kind of just pick one as an example, Mediterranean diet. It's really focused on, again, picking out basically fruits and vegetables you can prepare simply, you can eat naturally, and definitely you want to be able to kind of consume them as much as possible on a daily basis.
Right.
Choose the right variety. And, frequently I actually will tell my patient, just at least pick 2-3 colors a day. Don't go all brown.
There you go. Yeah,
Yep. And even if you have basically green, pick different shades of green. Try to throw in the purple in there. Try to throw in orange in there sometimes. And I think the hardest part with any type of kind of dietary change or lifestyle changes is that initial momentum. How do you get into that pattern where you realize, wait a second, I'm eating out 7-8 times per week. Can I cut that back down to 3-4 times a week? And once you're able to achieve that, then take it one step even further.
For individuals who really struggle with this, and that could be an underconsumption of calories, an underconsumption of nutrients, an overconsumption of calories, and even an overconsumption of nutrients. For many people who go down that path, for whatever reason, that turns into obesity, becoming severely overweight, severely high BMI, very imbalanced body composition in terms of lean muscle mass and body fat mass. I've heard this thrown around a lot over the years, whether obesity is an actual disease or it's just poor choices. Someone who works in medicine and in understanding obesity, what's your take on that?
So it's interesting. If you look at the term malnutrition, mal just means bad nutrition. So we are beginning to really think of obesity as a form of malnutrition.
Really?
Because when we typically think of malnutrition, you think of somebody with low BMI who may look anorexic, who may basically have trouble absorbing nutrients.
I think of all those underprivileged children, like in Africa, malnutrition, sponsor a child kind of thing. It looks very undernourished.
Correct. But remember, you can overconsume nutrition, overconsume calories, but yet still be malnourished.
Exactly.
Because you're consuming the wrong type of nutrition. And this kind of goes in not only in terms of impacts on the macros, but also on the micros as well. So if you are consuming a lot of processed food, you're not eating the right balanced diet, not surprising, you may actually see patients who may actually still run into issues in terms of nutritional deficiency and other type of metabolic imbalances.
So to really understand there, it could be, obesity, the disease of obesity could be a consequence of malnutrition, even in pursuit of healthier choices? Or what
Correct.
we deem to believe to be true healthier choices.
Correct. And unfortunately, what we see is that when you gain more of the adipose tissue, and this is something obviously we see being more problematic as we all get older, that itself propagate also in kind of inflammatory microenvironment, which makes it sometimes even more difficult to kind of overcome that. So, I would often tell my patient, look, you have a wheel that's spinning in the wrong way. I need to stop it, get it spinning in the right direction. And sometimes, we see patients where, if they're able to lose that first 5 to 10 pounds because they're obese, sometimes the next 5 to 10 pounds may actually be a little easier.
Is there a difference when you're looking at obesity, when you're with a patient in clinic versus what you see in a clinical study, so to speak, scientific world versus real world?
I think in the real world, it's all about keeping it real, meaning that, again, you would love for the patients who's consuming 2,500 calories to cut down to 1,400 calories because that's going to allow them to lose weight. But we realize, to deprive somebody of 1,000 calories overnight, they're going to be grouchy.
It's a big jump. It's a big jump.
Yep.
Yeah.
They're not going to feel well. And guess what? After probably about 2 weeks, they're just not going to come back.
Adherence is going to tank. Yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely, yeah.
So we actually tell patients, look, you know what? Let's see whether or not, cut out basically just a couple of things. We'll check in with you again, basically in a month or two, see how you're doing. If something's working, we'll continue with it. If something's not working, we'll make the adjustments. And patients like that. And, another example is for somebody who just does not exercise. You don't tell them, say, well, you have to hit the gym 4 times a week.
Yeah.
Let's see, can you, from Monday through Friday, get 1 day in. Once you're able to do that between Saturday and Sunday, get 1 day in.
Start small, build.
Exactly.
Build, build,
And, patients appreciate that because they feel like you're working with them, you're not preaching to them. And I think that's kind of where the problem is, when it comes to a lot of the approach to nutritional obesity in the healthcare circles, is there's almost still a sense of shame.
Oh, yeah.
And I think, sometimes, and even from a physician standpoint, they also don't feel like they can be comfortable in terms of bringing up, somebody is overweight and because of their weight, they have diabetes or hypertension. But I think most of the overweight and obese patients, they realize they have to lose weight. How do you bring up that topic in a non-judgmental way?
I want to share a little story with you from my time in clinic, actually. And there's a question I want to tie in with it. The question is, have you ever experienced this, or what is your take on the mental and emotional component to obesity? I was sharing with you earlier that, I used to see patients every day as a clinical health coach, and a lot of my patients were in weight loss programs. And I had one client, who we worked together for about a year. And within that year, for the first time in over a decade, we got her under 300 pounds. Wow. And it was amazing. But then all of a sudden, she stopped showing up for our coaching sessions. She stopped showing up to the group. She was dodging phone calls and emails. So I kind of called her out in a respectful way, of course. And the shame component, again, kind of came to light here, but in a really unique way, that this was my first time ever experiencing the mental and emotional component to behavior change, and especially weight loss. She said, Chase, I stopped feeling safe in my body. And as we began to unpack that, she shared with me in a very emotional state that she was feeling the same way she did as a young adolescent, early teen, because she shared with me that the guy that her mother was dating was physically, emotionally, and even sexually abusive to her mother and her younger sisters who were smaller than her. And so what she did, the only way she could avoid him touching her and to be protective of her family, she got bigger. And she became, her words, not mine, less attractive, but also more capable of protecting her family. And so it came down to this component that her body and mind were being triggered that, hey, there's a past experience of mental, emotional, physical, sexual abuse. If we get any smaller, this is going to happen again. Have you ever seen this in patients or in clinic? Or what is the correlation of mental and emotional self to the physical self when we're looking at obesity and really finally letting weight go and keep it off?
You know, you brought up a really interesting point. And if you look at a lot of the science that's kind of now centered around, why we gain weight, it's really moved beyond, well, if you're overweight, it's an issue with self-control. We know that's just not true. A lot
Maybe a little bit, but it's not the only reason.
Well, yes, people still need to kind of take charge and want to actually kind of get healthier. But we see a lot of patients where they really work at it and it's still a struggle. So, back in the 50s and 60s, they identify a part of the hypothalamus of the brain that will trigger basically hunger. But in the 80s and 90s, they recognized there is another part of the hypothalamus of the brain that actually are response to our emotional side of eating.
Really?
These are the things that triggers cravings. Wow. So one of the questions I will ask all my patients, who have really struggled with the weight, and they realize, yes, calorically, they probably could be eating less, is it's not just whether or not you get hungry, because a lot of people, they don't necessarily experience hunger.
Right.
I would actually ask them.
It's a craving.
It's a cravings. Yeah. And people sometimes will give me a blank look and I just say, well, I don't understand what do you mean by cravings. And I actually have to define, are there certain triggers that basically, is there a component of emotional eating? Is there a component of stress eating? And I actually will share my experience. I always just say, look, I have 3 kids and, when they go to bed around 10:30 or 11, my wife would see me in the kitchen and I'm just looking and she would say, are you hungry? I'm like, this is not hungry. I just want something.
I don't even know how I got here.
I
just blacked out, wound up in the kitchen. Sounds like me sometimes.
Well, for me, it's just boredom. And to say, okay, well, this is what I do for a living. And there's certain days where, I would still give in.
Turns out Dr. Hong's human as well. All right.
I think when you really ask those type of questions, the patients are more likely to kind of share with you their experiences. And they will tell you, like, you know what? For me, it may be more related to certain stressors at job, or it could be some of the other issues that may be going on.
Yeah, this was a tactic I use in clinic as well when really looking at trying to introduce new or reduce certain behaviors. It was very rarely the thing or the food or the action. It was, all right, walk me back like you're in your kitchen. You're making not the best choice or not the choice you want in terms of what you're eating. What were you thinking, doing? Who were you around? Where were you in the 30 minutes, hour before that? Right. All those are little bits of clues to the amount of willpower or self-control that you think you do or do not have. Right. Another quick little story I'll share with you. I think it's just an example that comes to mind a lot. Another patient of mine, for some reason, super high-performing lawyer in DC, and for some reason, she's like, out of nowhere recently around 7:30 p.m., I've got this sweet tooth. And I never had it before, and I don't know why, and I'm gaining weight, I'm eating ice cream, I'm keeping Ben & Jerry's in business. And we began to kind of unpack, okay, well, again, what's the time, what's the activity? And she shared with me that about 6 months before that, she kind of took a little mini sabbatical, spent time with her sister and her 2 young nieces. And she was the cool aunt for a couple weeks. Every night around that same time, she would take them out for ice cream. Right. And it was just a few weeks, but long enough to build that emotional trigger in her. So what did we do? Instead, around that time, it gives me goosebumps talking about the story. She would put down the ice cream or not even go there, and she would FaceTime her nieces. So she would get that emotional craving,
the happiness,
satisfied. And she's like, and then eventually the sweet tooth went away.
And I'll just share kind of related to that. And going back to what you were saying about food as an addiction. One of the medications out there we use to treat obesity is actually a combination of 2 medications. One is the same one that we use to help patients quit tobacco addiction. And the other one's the one that we use to help people with narcotic and alcohol addiction,
Cravings and addictions.
craving addiction. They're all time related. And, for some people, when someone's stressed, they want to light up a cigarettes. For other people, they turn to food.
They need that release.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow. Or just any other kind of emotional state.
Sure.
Wow. That's fascinating. Man, humans, we are weird. We are wild. We are wired so weirdly.
I say at the end of all day, we all like to eat.
Yeah. So having an expert such as yourself, and I kind of have just a few more kind of rapid fire questions, if you will, around nutrition, but also what I think are a lot of hot topics in the nutritional and even metabolic health space, cholesterol. I don't know how many times I am going to open up, Instagram or watch a nutrition video and it's like, it's bad today, good tomorrow. So many people are at war around cholesterol, dietary cholesterol affecting your cholesterol panels, how much we actually need more cholesterol for hormone health. I recently just learned that cholesterol actually is, in fact, a hormone. And so what's going on in the world of cholesterol? Is cholesterol as bad for our health as we have been led to believe? And what role does it really play in our overall quality, our overall well-being?
So it's interesting. Again, going back to the 80s, when they originally put out the food pyramid, one of the recommendation is that your dietary cholesterol intake per day should be less than 200 milligrams per day.
Okay.
Now, I will tell you, you can ask 100 physicians if they can tell you what 200 milligrams of dietary cholesterol.
What does that look like?
Nobody knows exactly what that means. So it was basically scientists who determined that based on older epidemiologic studies, you shouldn't cross that threshold.
So like in the lab, this is ideal.
Exactly.
Okay.
So since then, they realized, we obviously want people to stay away from, foods that are high in saturated fat, because there's a good correlation between, consumption of high saturated fat or trans fat, as well as early kind of risks for heart disease. But they've kind of gone away from basically the dietary cholesterol, But, you do realize, some of the very highly processed food that may be high in fat, they also tend to be high in cholesterol, but they're not taking such a hard stance saying, well, you have to avoid any food that contains any type of cholesterol, because, it is conflicting. It's like, seems like every other month somebody says, well, you can eat eggs. Another month you're like, you should avoid eggs.
Right, yeah.
So what we do know in terms of kind of your lipid profile, which is a predictor for your future heart disease, is yes, diet plays an important role. Yes, your weight can play an important role, but there are also other factors or physiologic influences that can also trigger why we see kind of increase, particularly in the LDL levels as we get older.
Which is the air quote here, bad
cholesterol. So these are the kind of the low density lipoproteins. And, we do know, so once that number starts to get over 100 into the 130, 160 range, there seems to be a pretty strong correlation for early heart disease.
It's a negative trajectory for quality of life.
Exactly. Yeah. But we also see patients where, they are very healthy, they eat a very good diet, but if you look at their family history, there's such a strong genetic component. Yeah. And for those patients, then the question becomes, well, my cardiologist, my primary care doctor, all of them wants to put me on the stand. Do I go on the stand? And again, I think from patient to patient, that, that's going to be a very individualized choice. But we recognize, yes, while diet plays a role, it's not the only thing that plays a role.
What role does dietary cholesterol play in directly influencing or not influencing our cholesterol when it comes time to get a lipid panel done?
So, you actually need some cholesterol in your diet for a lot of the metabolic functions. So, we tell patients, look, you know what, as long as you're eating a balanced diet, don't worry about basically your dietary cholesterol. Now,
balance meaning what?
Meaning that, again, if you're eating mainly a lot of plant-based regimen, particularly basically if you're preparing food without adding a lot of excess oil.
And like you were saying earlier, that higher fiber component as well.
Exactly. Or basically, and so a lot of things could be things that most people probably will agree with. You probably shouldn't be eating fried food 2-3 times a day.
Sure.
Exactly. So the food preparation kind of goes into it. But I think, what we need to get away with is basically some of the minuscule details in terms of, well, I can never have this or I can never have that. I think, there are certain things you may be able to enjoy a couple times a month. There are certain things that you can enjoy more frequently.
I love it. Anything I can get from a doctor that tells me, oh yeah, you can enjoy that more often, I'm here for it. To backtrack a little bit, to go back to kind of obesity, we definitely defined our terms there, and I think really shined a great light on what can lead to obesity and what people might be dealing with more than just the seemingly obvious, I'm eating too much and moving too little. What about just being overweight? When we look at maybe BMI, which I think, in my personal opinion and professional opinion, I think really only needs to be of concern when it's very, very low or very, very high. For example, I have been overweight by BMI standards for 15 years, just because of my body composition. But when we're looking at someone who is just overweight, let's say less than 30 pounds overweight, what ranges are causes for concern when left unchecked for too long with just, like, I know I got a few pounds to lose, I'll get to it. Do we really have as much time as we think when being overweight?
So there was actually a study that came out of Harvard about 10 years ago showing that is there a subpopulation of patients who can actually be healthy obese, okay, or healthy overweight.
Really?
And where we are beginning to recognize the problem with using body mass index, which is really just a calculation of your
Height and weight.
weight.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
It really doesn't take into consideration really how healthy you are. And what I mean by that is you can have somebody who's a bodybuilder. They may be 30 pounds overweight, but they're 10% body fat.
If that.
And then, or you can actually have, there's another term called sarcopenic obese, which means that you could be normal weight or even just slightly overweight, but you have 40% body fat because you're not exercising, you're not eating right. If you look at that sarcopenic obese patient, that particular patient's risk for diabetes is actually much higher than somebody who has 10% body fat. And so while, for some people, it's a quick screen, it really can miss the big picture. So, more and more we're recognizing, okay, if you have access to do a body composition, looking
like
at that
DEXA scan or an in-body scan.
Exactly, where you can look at body percentages changes, even if you're maintaining the same weight over a period of a decade, you could potentially be swapping out muscle for fat. Or hopefully vice versa in the other direction. And this is where, I often will ask the patient, well, yes, you weigh the same as 10 years ago. Does your pant size fit the same?
Touche. Absolutely.
And this is where we also start to understand, particularly in men and women in their 40s and 50s, their hormonal changes. It's not all that uncommon where we see it's much more difficult to lose the weight, particularly in perimenopausal or menopausal women, and definitely with men when there's also an obvious drop in the testosterone level.
Hormones are the wild, wild west. We won't even go down that rabbit hole right now because that could be a 2-3 hour episode in and of itself. You clearly are someone, though, that has a lot of knowledge around nutrition in clinic and in the real world. But in my experience, at least, we don't always get you as our primary care provider or have access to someone such as yourself in traditional allopathic care who has the formal training, the clinical training, but is aware of real nutrition, not maybe just an elective they had in med school. What can us, the individual, the everyday person who is seeking medical care, what can we be looking for? What questions can we be asking of our care provider to really make sure that they have this knowledge base? Because getting labs read is one thing, but really being with the patient and the human to understand real world application is another.
Right. And, I often like to term kind of the progression of medicine. When I was in training, it's what we call medicine 1.0. It's about being able to spend 60 minutes with the patient because we have the time. At that time, we did not have electronic medical record system. Right. And now kind of transition over the past 20 plus years to medicine 2.0. We now have the EHR. We now have a lot of data available. But if you look at the way we actually kind of have the interaction with the patient, it's still very much the same, except for now we have to see more patients.
What's the national average visit time primary care provider, like 11 minutes or something?
Yeah, and that's basically not counting in, by the time you check in, they get your vitals, they get your prescription. Most physicians may spend 5 minutes with a patient. And, within that 5 minutes, they have to ask you whether you have any acute issues, are you up to date in terms of kind of your labs, and then they haven't really talked to you. They're talking to you. So this is where I really want to see whether or not, the society as a whole can transition to what I call medicine 3.0. And this is really now shifting the focus. I'm not working basically for you. Let me work with you.
I like that. I like that.
And meaning that, my first question when I kind of see a patient is, what can I do for you today? Is there something you'd like to discuss with you? Even though I may have 10 things I want to discuss with the patient because I already has labs, it may take our visit in a completely different direction. And it may be important for that patient. So, frequently when we look at, the pillars in terms of the kind of what we can do better in terms of health span and as well as longevity, it's not just focusing on the number because we have all the numbers in the world. And, pretty soon the machines will be able to analyze the numbers. I mean, with all the AI. It's about how do we improve their quality of life. Going back to the similar questions, are you sleeping well? Are you feeling well? Are you noticing any fatigue? Are you able to think clearly? I can guarantee you a lot of physicians, unfortunately, because of how quick the visits are, they're not asking
I
those
imagine.
questions.
Yeah. Thank you so much for doing that. I mean, I've seen a lot of doctors over the years, and I can imagine me stepping into an appointment now, and for anybody else out there, that would, I think, one, catch you off guard in the best way possible. Right. To have someone whom we are going to thinking, okay, they know everything, they know what's best for me, but to actually sit down and want to navigate this with you is so empowering. And I think in many ways shows us how much power we actually have over our health that we maybe have been giving away unnecessarily to these healthcare providers that, of course, serve a great purpose, especially in acute care. But when we're talking about, actually, now that you mention it, I haven't been thinking clearly. My sleep has been mad. But to hear my doctor ask me about it, I'm going to take it more seriously now.
Right. Well, and because I think a lot of times the patient may either feel uncomfortable or they won't necessarily feel like that's pertinent enough information to offer. And sometimes that could be the earliest sign of a disease that we just don't know about quite yet.
So we were kind of talking about this. I don't know if we actually were recording just yet, but let me unpack it a little bit more with you. Nowadays, whether that's through our primary care provider or so many other new telehealth companies and wellness companies, we have access and also a reduction in cost of what we didn't have access to 5-10 years ago and would have cost thousands, tens of thousands of dollars in terms of advanced metabolic panels. Are they for everyone? Or are we giving too much information to the masses and causing more problems, doing more harm than good?
I always say information can be powerful, but it can also create stress. Okay, I mean, it's what you do with information that's going to be the most useful. So yes, there are certain recommendations, coming from U.S. Preventive Task Force in terms of screening things we need to do for our patient. For instance, people over the age of 40, they need to at least get a baseline lipid panel, making sure that their sugar numbers are normal, their blood pressure is within normal. But there are going to be certain population of patients where, because of their strong family history, because of their other metabolic risks, it goes beyond basically kind of just those simple screening. And so for those population of patients, being able to identify those risk factors or diseases early with biomarkers now that's available to us. And again, the beauty is that some of those tests may have been very inexpensive or basically really not accessible 10 years ago. People can actually get them. It's, again, making sure that basically it's easy to access for people who really needs it the most.
Are you familiar with the show Limitless? The documentary came out, I think, on Disney or Nat Geo with Chris Hemsworth. And there was a portion in there with Dr. Peter Attia. Basically, I might be butchering this, but basically, Chris Hemsworth went through this very advanced panel, metabolic health and genetic testing. And I believe it was his ApoE2 marker that came back, and having that typically puts someone at a higher risk for Alzheimer's, dementia, kind of going down that route. And his response, now, of course, this is produced Hollywood clips and stuff. So what I saw was someone that took that news pretty seriously, of course, but I wonder if he took it too far in terms of just because there was a marker for something and statistically it might put you in a higher bracket for this. I wondered if that knowledge actually sent him too far down the rabbit hole and now is really going to push him on the higher end of that percentage versus if he didn't know it. And I think objectively, we could all say Chris Hemsworth is doing great things for his health, physical body composition and all that. So someone, I think, could argue that if he kept that up, that even being aware of that wouldn't really matter. I guess we'll never really know, but I guess my question there to kind of expand on, is too much information a bad thing? Let's say we do get this metabolic test. Let's say we do get this biomarker, this genetic marker back. Is that set in stone?
So I think it's all about, again, taking a step back and looking at the big picture. Yes, we have the lab biomarkers, but more and more we are actually now having data in terms of coming from analyzing some of these stool, looking at the microbiome, looking at also genetic profile. And, traditionally we're talking about basically just looking at genetic markers that can predispose somebody, let's just say, to a certain type of cancers, neurocognitive diseases, diabetes and so forth. But we now even have the technology to say, okay, well, even if we have these markers, what can we do from a lifestyle, dietary standpoint that can actually kind of lower those risks? And so going back to kind of your question, yes, it's great to have that data, but I think before we actually offer the testing, we need to understand what we're going to do with the information, because by offering the test, if the data is not going to change our management, then does it really offer anything? But in some cases where the data can actually offer important information, and then again, just because you may have multiple risk factors, whether it's for dementia or for diabetes, there are actually things you can do naturally, without necessarily just going on medication to potentially lower those risks. And I'm going to use kind of one example. So going back to kind of what I was saying in terms of being able to turn genes on and off, there are actually now something called epigenetics chips, where you can just collect a small sample of your saliva and you can actually say, look, you know what? Yes, unfortunately, I have all these bad genes, A, B, C, but let's see if I kind of go on a Mediterranean diet. I pick up on my exercise. Then basically, if you wait 6 months or 12 months down the line, you can actually see some of those genes actually being shut off as if you were not born with those genes. Yep.
Wow. I want you to go back and say that last part again. As if we were not born with these genes. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And it is definitely not a doomsday scenario. You absolutely hold the power to be able to make a big kind of change in terms of lowering those lifetime risks.
I mean, there's so much there, but that not only is profound information in terms of what lifestyle, what exercise, what nutrition can do for us beyond any external goal, and even internal in terms of improving our metabolic panel, lipid panel, blood glucose, metabolic health, all this stuff. But at the genetic level, having dominion over what is on and off is so empowering for us here and now. But also imagine we do that. What are we doing for the next generation?
Absolutely. I think it's wonderful. I'm excited. And that's part of why, I share a lot of these informations with my patients. I just say, look, you're not just going to be working with me. You're going to be working with a life coach. You may be working with a dietitian. For some people, they may be working with a trainer just to really optimize your health. And again, one of the words I often like to use is be proactive. It's all about kind of optimizing your health early. Don't wait until you have the disease when you're in your 60s and 70s. You can do something about it in your 30s and 40s and 50s.
I know my audience is. Nobody out here is not doing that. Or if you're new, then you won't after this episode. So beyond lifestyle and beyond nutrition and beyond labs, a lot of us reach to supplementation for optimization, for lack of nutritional quality, nutritional value. Particularly, I want to kind of highlight something I think that is very trending right now, but for anybody in especially the physical fitness space, this is not news. That's creatine. But now I'm seeing a lot of new trials and science come out supporting creatine beyond the typical application and use of muscle mass, of muscle saturation, of boosting ATP, getting that extra rep or two in. I'm talking mental health, brain health, and I think a lot of women now are gravitating towards creatine when maybe before they were thrown off because of the assumption that I'm going to get too big or I'm going to be bloated. So what is going on now in the world of creatine as a supplement maybe that you would recommend for general health?
So let me answer the question first by saying, if you look at some of the supplement data, some of the vitamin and mineral supplementation, or even kind of beyond that, you look at some of the functional herbs and so forth. Unfortunately, it is a little bit of a wild west out there. So absolutely make sure you get quality stuff. But if you're able to supplement properly, there are definitely some potential benefits there. However, it doesn't take place of basically eating properly. You're eating basically a lot of fast food. You're eating high fat food. You can take a lot of supplement. And sometimes people get this false sense of security. They say, well, as long as I pop a multivitamin, you know what? Everything is covered.
All the multivitamins in the world aren't going to undo all the KFC.
Exactly. So, but, you do also have a lot of people who are really trying. They're really making a lot of great dietary changes. And they want to kind of look into that next step. And, there's supplementation when it comes to basically just, for certain patients at risk. During pregnancy, there's a reason why, you kind of add additional folic acid and potentially iron. For patients with certain metabolic diseases, they may benefit from vitamin D. And going back to kind of what you're saying with the creatine, it can be helpful. Now, I often will tell patients, look, you're just taking creatine, you're not exercising. Don't expect to just bulk up. But you'll be surprised how often people will assume, well, if I just take a lot of it, maybe it just work magically. But for patients where they are trying to improve on their lean muscle mass because functionally they like to get stronger, then I think creatine can play a role. And one of the questions we get often is, well, should I just take creatine? Should I improve my dietary protein quality? How many grams of protein should I be getting? And this is where, if you look at being able to access the data from a body composition, instead of guessing based off of the weight, you can look at the lean muscle mass, and then there are specific equations.
There's a little formula there.
Formulas there you can actually follow. And then, there are also patients who actually will combine basically creatine with BCAAs. And there are even other specific amino acids out there that's designed specifically even for the elderly. So there's, for instance, one called HMB, which is basically hydroxymethylbutyrate, where particularly in patients in their 60s and 70s, it's actually been shown to improve muscle mass even quicker.
Wow.
Than some of the other supplements out there. So bottom line is, if you kind of really take a look at it and look at the science that's been exploding just within the past 5-10 years, we didn't have that data 20 years ago.
No.
Right. No. But I will also caution this, definitely if you're going to go on a creatine supplement, which for some patients can be very useful, definitely make sure that you're working with somebody who understands your physiology. Make sure your doctor is aware of it, just so that if they see any changes on your blood test, at least they know you're on a particular supplement.
Right. You mentioned the word multivitamin earlier, and I think that's one that typically I would say, honestly, without knowing you from Adam, anybody ask me a question, what supplement should I get on? I typically would say, especially in my health coaching days, a good multivitamin. A good multivitamin supplemented with, nutritional awareness can really go a long way, because even if you are, air quote here, eating all the right things, depending on if you know the source of all the foods, we're in like mineral depletion. I'm forgetting a term here, but basically just the bioavailability of a lot of these nutrients, it's just not there like it used to be. Would you agree that general blanket statement here, majority of humans could benefit from a multivitamin? Or what supplementation would you recommend in general someone at least look at to consider to improve their nutrition, to improve metabolic panels and health panels even?
So it depends on who you ask. If you ask an epidemiologist, if you look at kind of a lot of publications out there looking at the physician health study that was published about 20 years ago, according to that study, basically there's absolutely no benefits to multivitamins.
Really? Nothing?
But nothing. But remember, this is basically a retrospective epidemiologic look. And the way they did these analysis is basically they just said, well, if we kind of follow a lot of these patients over 20, 30 years, and we actually see which of those patients are taking a multivitamin versus not, are there differences in terms of their cancer risk, cardiovascular risk, or even morbidity and mortality?
Okay.
Now, there are some prospective studies that's been done. Some of those studies also did not show a benefit. But you can also make the argument that basically, if you look at that specific subset of population, they tend to be older, okay? So the question is that, are you supplementing later in life where you may not already gotten the benefit because the disease already has progressed to such a state because of potential deficiencies? So I think going back to your question, would a 20-year-old that basically want to go on the supplement benefit from it? We really don't know, but I do think basically as long as they're coming from a reputable source, it is definitely something where, again, this is in addition to eating healthy.
Right.
Probably from a safety profile, they probably will do okay with it. I think where we get concerned is, sometimes people will take it one step too far. They say something is good, more better. Okay.
Yes,
and so I have seen patients where they come in with 20, 30 supplements. Okay. Now, if you're taking 5, 6, 7, okay, there are different types of supplements, vitamin D, omega-3s, B complex, that's all understandable.
Okay.
But I see people load up on just different things. And the concern there is, number one, how do all the supplements interact with each other?
That's a crucial component a lot of people don't know about and many people overlook.
Yeah. I mean, like for instance, if you're taking your iron with your calcium, a lot of them, they can interfere with kind of how they are being absorbed. Okay. But also, once you start to take a lot of supplement, particularly some of the potential fast soluble vitamin, there are actually real risks when it comes to toxicity.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think it goes back to what I was saying, it's more about optimizing the dose, not just mega dosing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with urolithin A?
Yes.
Can you describe what urolithin A is? And the reason I'm bringing it up, we've talking about supplementation and longevity. I have been rotating this into my supplementation for about the past year, and I'm just amazed. I do like the benefits that I get from it, but personally, I'm just amazed at the research behind this compound, urolithin A, especially for longevity and muscle maintaining body composition and muscle mass and strength as well.
Yeah, I don't know of as many studies specifically in clinical trials. I think most of the studies there were in animal studies.
Okay.
So I think with any type of supplement, one of the things I'm always waiting for are the clinical studies.
Right.
And part of the reason why, and now the challenge is going to be anytime you're looking at longevity. Clinical studies are always challenging because, obviously we can't be tracking these patients for 20, 30 years. Are there kind of surrogate markers you can actually track? So like, for instance, when they did a lot of the original studies looking at intermittent fasting, they were looking at one particular marker called IGF-1, okay, or insulin growth factor 1, which we know basically if it's activated, it tends to actually turn off some of the longevity genes.
Wow, okay.
So, but for some of this, so they've done that basically comparing different type of diet, but I am not aware whether or not there are also studies, again, whether they specifically look at some of these known surrogate kind of markers.
Interesting. I would love to share with you offline the research from Timeline Nutrition, Amazentis. They've got a 10-year clinical study around urolithin A that to me is very, very profound. So I'll share that with you.
I'd love to look at that.
One other question I want to get, kind of getting towards the end here, I want to get to, we talked about it before we started, and that's around fasting. You were talking about intermittent fasting a second ago. Intermittent fasting, I think for my audience, is not something new. It's been around for many, many years in diet culture and especially bodybuilding as a way to, condense your feeding window, as a way to get to autophagy. Now in like the biohacker and human optimization realm, intermittent fasting compared to periodic fasting, there seems to be a lot of confusion and overlap in terms of you can get all the benefits of one by doing the other. Can you set the record straight for us in terms of intermittent fasting and periodic fasting? What are the differences, and why should we maybe consider one over the other? What really has the most bang for the buck here?
Yeah, so if you look way back, I mean, people have been fasting for years, probably thousands of years. I mean, most people basically, back then, they were fasting for religious reasons, for holistic reasons.
Or you just didn't have access to food.
Exactly. And so, if you look at kind of how our body's wired, we do know that basically a little bit of stress to your body is a good thing, okay? Because it kind of really kind of target and actually augment some of your survival genes. So, if you look at basically some of the original studies designed around intermittent fasting, these are basically kind of short-term fasting. Typically is 12 to 24 hours. And there are all sorts of various formats of this. Some of the actually fasting regimen actually allow you to eat a little bit as long as you keep it to 5.
Come on.
I know. So they actually say, well, as long as
fasting-ish.
Well, they just realize, as long as you keep it less than 500 calories, you're still kind of fasting.
Okay.
So, but where basically are concerning is, people realize, okay, well, any type of fasting, we do know that it leads to a little bit of weight loss. And if you kind of look at basically improvements in terms of blood sugar, blood pressure, and even some of the cholesterol panel, I think all of the different type of fasting will allow you to achieve that. Where there are a little bit of confusion or basically conflict is, okay, well, if I fast for 12 to 24 hours versus if I take it a little bit further, 24 hours to 48 or even up to 72, even if I just do that basically a couple of times a month, do I get additional benefits? So they went.
More is better.
More
like
is better in this
earlier,
case. So they've actually done some studies where they have people on water-based fast for all the way up to 5 days and beyond.
Wild, yeah.
Now, I first say, I wouldn't be able to do it, but there are some people who can do it. And there are even some diets out there that are trying to mimic fasting. There's even something called fast mimetic regimen where basically you're supposed to be able to eat certain foods, but at the molecular cellular level, some of those fasting pathways are still being basically properly regulated.
Interesting.
But going back to kind of your question, yes, there are certain things that will happen within the first 12 to 24 hours. If you look at kind of our energy utilization, we start to go into ketosis. Your glycogen storage is going to run out probably by about that 24-hour mark. Our body starts to basically turn to either amino acid or basically breakdown of the fatty acid. And if you kind of
converts fuel source where what we're getting for energy, yeah.
And if you look at basically kind of just measurement of ketone bodies, it definitely starts to rise probably as early as 12 hours, but definitely starts to peak once you get into that 24 to 36-hour mark.
Okay.
And ketones is actually a good thing in this sense because if you actually look at some of the things that can augment neurotransmitters, ketone actually can bypass and get across the blood-brain barriers.
Yeah.
And there's actually something called BDNF or brain-derived neurotrophic factors. And they've been able to show
use
this.
that daily. Yeah.
Perfect. So one of the things then becomes, okay, well, I would love to be able to have this really apply to longevity. So some of the terms that's been thrown out there, cellular regeneration, autophagy, cellular senescence,
Yeah.
stem cell mobilization. What does that all mean?
Sounds pretty fancy.
Fancy.
Big terms that people can throw out to sound like this is the solution, right?
Exactly. And part of where they are looking at all of this is they realize basically, part of why our organs starts to break down is, think about it. You have a car for 70 years, things are just not going to last as long.
Yeah.
Now, in your 20s, you can drink a little bit more, but your liver can probably regenerate right away. If you do similar type of damage, your body just won't be able to completely recover. And part of what allows your body to recover is, for instance, if some of the cells in your tissue dies, your body should be able to send a signal to your bone marrow. And they're actually what we call mesenchymal stem cells that gets a signal to then basically get trafficked to that target tissue and then replenish.
Wow.
We know basically in your teens and 20s, that makes up about 2 to 3% of your cells in the circulation. When you're in your 50s, 60s, that drops by tenfold. You have only about 0.2 to 0.3%
That's huge.
of those mesenchymal progenitor cells. Okay.
Wow.
What we found out is actually only through extended periodic or prolonged fasting can you start to mobilize
Really?
those cells. So that's just one example.
Wow, it's huge.
Same thing is, yes, you may start to see some autophagy pretty early on, but you really don't get the full benefit of the autophagy in terms of the cellular cleaning until you basically get to that 36 or 48-hour mark.
Wow.
And I think this is where kind of the science is really fascinating because you're trying to basically balance, all those additional kind of longevity benefit to kind of creating something yet practical enough most of the consumers can do.
That's such a clear understanding. Thank you for that. Well, Dr. Hung, I want to be mindful of our time here, and this has been a wealth of information for me and my audience, so thank you. What does it mean to you to live a life ever forward? When you hear those words, through what you do and helping people understand nutrition, obesity, metabolic health, all these things we've been talking about, how do you live a life ever forward?
I think it starts with the mind. I think, people don't realize, right, how you feel, your physical health. It starts with basically having good emotional health, good mental health. I always say, it's easy to be worried. I mean, I actually will restrict how many hours of news I read a day because, it can be downright depressing. But I also realize, I look around. I have a beautiful family. I have generally pretty good health. So I count my blessings. And then I realize, what can I do? Yes, there are definitely things that I've noticed. I'm slowing down. When I try to basically play sports with my kids, I have to warm up now. I can't just get up and run. But I also realize, it's not about working harder. It's about working smarter. And this is where I'm always looking forward. It's not about what could I have done differently. And I always say, look at baby steps. Don't feel like, I have to achieve everything all in one sitting. So
there's never a right or a wrong answer. So thank you for your interpretation. Yeah. Where can my audience go to connect with you or learn more about the work that you do? We'll, of course, have everything down in the show notes for everybody, but where can we send them?
So I am the Chief Medical Officer, basically for LifeForce. I'm also a clinical professor at USC. I'm on faculty both at the Keck School of Medicine as well as at Davis School of Gerontology.
That's where my wife went to her FNP program.
Yeah, so I've been very fortunate and privileged to kind of be involved in a lot of not only patient care, but also involved in clinical trials, looking at nutrition, aging, and who knows, beyond.
All right. Well, this has been a wealth of information. Like I said, thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.